Hello again, Bighorn, and welcome to another installment of Jupiter Training for Leaders with Task Force Bighorn. Again, thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. Few housekeeping items before we begin. Disclaimers: the views presented are those of the speaker or author only and don't necessarily represent the views of DoD or its components. We're using this with the fair use doctrine. Under that, we're using it for commentary, teaching, scholarship, etc. And this is an educational context platform. Everything within this is specifically for the educational and leadership development purposes of Bighorn. So, thank you for joining us. Let's get into our next book. As we do that, let's remember we have a number of tenets within the brigade: on time, on target, every time. Let's not forget that as we go through this. We're talking about book number 6, Never Split the Difference, Negotiating as If Your Life Depended on It by Chris Voss. For those astute people watching this, yes, we did skip a book 5. That's because one of the books in here is called The Liberator. That's a self-reflection book, a book to read. We're not going to actually discuss it specifically within Jupiter Training, but it is a book to be aware of and something that I wanted to draw your attention to. So yes, we did go straight to book 6, Never Split the Difference. The bluff and reasoning for this book is a general difference than we've seen on some others. It's a different way in which we are utilizing our negotiating skills and our actual mindset to accomplish bigger and better things. So the bluff is life can seem like a negotiation. So with this, we're empowering a leader to interact with their team in a variety of ways. And some of those are developing the leadership style. Here we're learning, using, recognizing, and having different tools within this book to be superior in our interactions as necessary, and allows leaders to properly utilize the knowledge to build on the overall team success. It's an overall mind shift book as much as a how do I win lesson or discussion. And here, one of the big takeaways too is that we want to build the toolkit. Within that toolkit, this can be one of those tools utilized. Again, we're looking at the long term, the Bighorn legacy, what is needed for organizational leadership in the long term. So with all of that, we're using a mind shift book in terms of how we actually interact with others, how we can negotiate better. And yes, feel free to use this on superiors, high level ranking within the positions that you're holding, whatever it is, as long as it is better for the soldier. Remember, we're all about soldier care and soldier betterment within Bighorn. The 3 big discussion points we're going to talk about before delving into the smaller ones. Number 1, active listening is the foundation for successful negotiation. Active listening, it's foundational. 2, embracing the conflict is important, and we must utilize this professionally. 3, as leaders, our targeted questions influence outcomes. Our targeted questions influence outcomes. Now, just think for a second among yourself, how many times has somebody in charge of you in the formation saying or asking or doing something different? Those create an influence on us, and that leads to a specific targeted outcome. So, emotional intelligence is paramount within everything we're actually talking about. Fundamentally, negotiation is an emotional game. It's playing on the emotions that the adversary has within that negotiation, or if it's an amicable negotiation, it's playing that emotion for that we can all be part of a community. So the emotional game that human society is set up for is specifically talking about the negotiation. So effective negotiators understand that there is an emotional component to all of this. And those professional negotiators leverage that emotion, both their own specific emotion, also the counterparts, the ones they're negotiating against. So effective negotiation, applied people smarts, a psychological edge in every domain of life. And we're using our logic and our reason toward a decision. But logic is reasoning ourselves toward that specific decision. Still, emotion plays a role in this. So active listening and tactical empathy. Tactical empathy is something that I took away from this book. I totally didn't know before. It is important. So using that, we'll talk about a little bit later, but having that ability to employ tactical empathy is important. So mirroring is a technique of repeating the last few words or core sentiment of your counterpart to encourage them to open up. This is also called isopraxism, which is imitation. We're copying each other to be a comfort to somebody else. The second way we actively listen is labeling. We're identifying and verbalizing what the other person's emotions are. We're listening to what they're telling us, and then we're using that with the labels. It seems like, it sounds like, It looks like. That's what we are using to convey to our counterparts that we are actually listening. Tactical empathy. It's being able to recognize your counterpart's perspective and then gain trust and understanding. So this is one of the core competencies of actual effective negotiation. We're using that empathy to recognize what somebody is, their perspective, and then use that for trust and understanding further down the road. The last one is one that we usually don't associate with good discussions and negotiations. It's silence. Silence is a good thing because if we use it, we're allowing that silence to actually do its work after a label that we have placed. So after someone saying it looks like, it sounds like, it seems like, and then we have a prompt to the other side, our counterpart, to reveal some more information, just waiting for them to respond. There's a number of books within the negotiation and self-help realm using the power of yes. And we want to move away from that pressure. So the power of no is what we're talking about on this slide. No is the start point to the negotiation. When you know when somebody says, hey, no, N-O, not going to do that. Cool. We have established the starting point of a negotiation that we can continue to refine and go forward under. So moving away from the pressure of saying yes, the documents emphasize that no can be incredibly useful in understanding the true concerns. So here we look at someone telling you no, then we just rethink that no into an alternative and more accurate meaning. Specifically, I am not yet ready to agree. You are making me feel uncomfortable. Those could be used instead of the no. But when we use no, we're orienting the question that can be effective. For instance, the email, have you given up on this project? No, I have not given up on this project. Now see that mind shift there. We're shifting from a no to a yes, or a yes to a no. Which one do you think is more powerful? Saying, have you given up on this project? No. Cool. That's the start of what we're going to do next. So the prompts engage by encouraging the response, and that specific response is clarifying the position the person is in. So again, that clarification is achieved through no. Now let's look at our voice and our tone. There's a number of things within the book that Chris Voss draws out, and there's a number of things that I very much encourage you to read. The most powerful tool, though, is the voice and tone within our verbal communication. So there's three main voices that he discusses in this book, and they all have very good and very specific uses. The first one is the late night FM DJ voice. It's a calm and controlled voice. It's an ability to convey to the other person. It's calm. It's controlled. They don't have to worry about this. Also, it conveys that, hey, I'm in charge here. However, it's not something that needs to be threatening. The positive, playful voice is a friendly and engaging voice. It's something that conveys to the other person that, hey, we can keep talking. We're all friends here. It's all going to be okay. And the direct and assertive voice is something to use sparingly. Again, most of these discussions and these negotiations, they're not about domineering or saying, hey, I'm in charge. There's an art to it. And again, these different voice types are something for you to experiment with. As leaders, we all know when these have been vilified in their usage. We also know that when they've actually been able to convey a very specific meaning just by a single word in a different tone of voice. So play around with them. Don't take somebody else's and use it as your own. Take somebody else's, see how that was impactful, and then find your own way to implement these three. And one interesting thing from the book was the concept of actually smiling, even when we're talking on the phone. So smiling, for example, in this, you can't see me. You don't know if I'm smiling or not. However, in my voice, you can actually tell if I am smiling sometimes, because smiling while talking positively impacts the tone of communication. So there's a lot to be said for body language, right? There's a lot to be said for that specific way somebody sits or folds their arms or looks at you or engages with you. There's also something to be said for that tone. And that's what we're looking at within this set. So let's move on to one of the next is calibrated questions. So there's a number of ways to approach how we actually have decision making in our toolkit. One of those is asking the question. So using questions that begin with how or what to force the other party to think and solve the problem. So asking the other party a question can really come out with the answer. Also, how often have we said, hey, identify the solution, then tell me what your answer is so that we can actually implement some sort of solution in the future? But the how or the what is actually a forceful word to use. A yes no question or a close ended question is saying, hey, this is a yes no, and then they move on. But there's nothing that actually is used to convey a thought from that other individual when they answer your question. It's just a yes or a no. And usually those are because somebody's trying to get their point across in a very specific way. So a close-ended question usually isn't what we want in negotiations. But if we avoid and don't use yes no, we eliminate yes no answers, there's a ability to force our counterpart to apply their own mental energy to solving our own problems. Very effective. It also takes a lot of practice to have open-ended questions. How am I supposed to do that is a very calibrated, useful question. How am I supposed to do that? So that subtly challenges an offer without being aggressive. If somebody says, hey, will you take out the trash tomorrow? And your response is, how am I supposed to do that? Well, now that other person might help you figure that out, and you're not really having to do all the heavy lifting and heavy work. How am I supposed to do that is throughout the whole book, and it's really interesting how Chris Voss uses it within the context of his negotiations and how he has seen it be successful. So calibrated questions should gently direct the conversation toward your objective. Again, the calibrated question, there is an end in mind and there is something that we're going after, but it's some way to gently direct that conversation to where we want to go. The that's right breakthrough. So the big thing here is we're not aiming for yes. We're not saying we want to get to the yes. We want to get to that's right. Also, you're right. That's not something that we want to hear because that immediately ends the conversation. Somebody saying that's right signals a genuine agreement, understanding, and acknowledgement. And the two parties say, okay, that's right. Let's move on from here in the way that we are designating to go. However, if somebody says, you're right, conversation's done, negotiation's done. It's the worst thing because it ends what's happening and the other person goes, you're right. I am right. Cool. Let's move on. Using that's right is a subtle shift and a subtle word shift, but it's that genuine agreement between the two individuals by saying, okay, we both agree, even though they're just saying that's right. Bending the reality in terms of framing. So here the framing is in the parentheticals because really bending reality is all about how we're actually looking at it and perceiving it. So here the reframing situation influences the perception. That is, here's the quotations here. That is, I'll explain a variety of tools for framing negotiation in such a way that your counterpart will unconsciously accept the limits you place on the discussion. That's really framing. So you're bending the reality. The quote is, hey, I am in control of this conversation and this negotiation, but you are not going to be conscious in terms of where you're going with that. The tools used within framing allow me to say, here are the limits that I am placing on this conversation. So understanding the value of something can be altered simply by perspective. So that perspective is the key here within what we're looking at. So the value of something that someone else has, and then how to alter that by perspective. So using fair within this context is powerful as people want to be treated fairly. So if we somehow use fair within our discussions and framing something that's going on, like we saw before, the usage of that's fair. People want to be treated fairly within everything they're doing, including negotiations. So framing the reality around that is very important sometimes. So let's talk about haggling and the Ackerman system. So haggling is just a part of many negotiations. Sometimes people don't like it. They don't like to go to whatever markets abroad and haggle with people saying whatever amount is and then countering with another one. But really it is part of all negotiations. A different way is the Ackerman system, which is a structured approach to haggling, and there's specific percentage-based raises. So the target price starts off at a certain percentage, and then those are back and forth at different percentages of the target price. But here there's a caution. That's not as beneficial as a lot of other ways to go about this. If we use non-round numbers and add non-monetary items at the end of a negotiation, that actually increases the sincerity of the offer. So if we're using a non-round number, saying somebody goes from, 95% to 100% is way different than somebody going from 85% to 93.28. A very different psychological response. So haggling and the Ackermann system can be combined to work differently in how we might approach something. So just, again, a tool for your toolkit to be mindful of going forward. Let's talk about black swans. Now, there's a lot of terms and definitions for those, but specifically in this book, black swans are pieces of information that, were they to be uncovered, would change everything. So black swan is a piece of information. If it's uncovered, everything changes. So both parties, they're looking for information, but black swans can be obvious and hidden. They can radically shift a negotiation. There's something that is so earth-shattering with that negotiation that everything will be changed. So the black swan is some sort of information, and both parties will have those to some degree. Both parties will have some sort of information potentially. But there's 3 types of leverage that a black swan could potentially capture. So within the system and the leverage we have, there's positive, there's negative, and there's normative. So knowing if this is going to be a different leverage within this conversation will really shift and change how we're looking at everything. Is this going to be a positive leverage, a negative leverage, or normative leverage? Preparation within everything is key. And it's also key within using the negotiation techniques within this book. So it's even part of how we look at the Army culture. So specifically when we're going through how we're disseminating an op board and looking at how we're developing it, part of it is preparation of the battlefield. So preparation is key. Traditionally, when people looked at negotiation, they would look at the BATNA, or the best alternative to no agreement. But really, the BATNA looks at a limited perspective, and it usually sets targets way too low. So a BATNA, if you're thinking of the outcome, you're looking at the best and the worst, right? The best alternative to no agreement, as in nothing happens. So within that, you're falling to your highest level of preparation. So push BATNA aside for a second. In any type of negotiation here in Bighorn and in our civilian lives and whatever we do, we're falling to our highest level of preparation. So if our preparation level is extremely high and we fall to that, that could be okay. However, if our preparation level is very low and we fall to that, maybe not as okay. So that level of preparation, that's a key concept which highlights how important anticipating another side's perspective and potential counter arguments can be. So within this, whenever we're going into a negotiation or wherever we're going into a conversation, let's use this to combine our own thought process and how we're looking at something with the opponents or whoever else we're talking to. Because within that, there's going to be potential counter arguments. There's going to be other things that the other side brings up. And I'm not just saying this within a negotiation context. I'm saying this within an overall context of that's how we should prepare and actually be mindful of somebody else's viewpoint on the world, how they're looking at what we're doing currently. So all of that combined, falling to the highest level of preparation. So there's different negotiation types. So we also would like to understand those, right? So there's different ways to go about it. There's the analyst negotiation type, the assertive negotiation type, and the accommodator negotiation type. Again, those are all have their place at some point, but just be mindful of what we personally are dealing with and also the other side and who they are dealing with. Are we going to utilize one of these, and is the other side going to counter? So again, tools in our tool belt to be able to think about and implement as needed. Also, the big takeaway from this is we would like to avoid falling victim or being subjugated to people utilizing these tools against us. So being able to identify these tools and being able to talk about how they're going to be important or not is part of this analysis within the tool belt. That's it. I know this was a shorter one. I know that there's a lot more questions that can be answered. But again, if anyone has any questions, feedback, additions, disagreements, comments, concerns, whatever, please reach out. Part of this is hard because we're not going to meet face to face, but if you would like to, or you want some specific training on a subject, please reach out and let me know. As always, I appreciate everyone in Bighorn. I appreciate everyone part of Jupiter Training being willing to do this. So if you have anything, please reach out to us. Again, thank you for being part of Bighorn. How are we going to make Bighorn better? How are we going to improve Bighorn? How are we going to take what we've learned here and go forward and make Bighorn an ever better place to be? destined to climb.